My daughter and her husband took my company, mocked me, and left me humiliated in front of the world. But I wore silence like armor, planted seeds of revenge in the shadows, and waited. They thought I was finished, yet my rise became their downfall. What happened next, they never saw coming. Before continue, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. That's free and only way to support us. Thank you. I still remember the day my throne fell as if it were burned into my memory with fire. The air in the boardroom felt thick, suffocating, like someone had stolen the oxygen out of it. I had walked into that room countless times before, always with my head held high, always with people rising to greet me, their respect shining in their eyes. But that day, no one stood. No one even smiled. They all sat there stiffly, waiting, as if I were just another name on the agenda. The company was my life's work. It wasn't just brick and glass, or contracts and numbers. It was the sweat on my brow, the late nights when everyone else slept, the sacrifices I made when others were chasing comfort. I built it from nothing, from days when I could barely afford to put gas in my car, to a corporation people in the city admired. I thought it was untouchable. But I didn't know that betrayal grows in silence, in shadows, in the places you trust the most. My daughter sat across from me at the table. My little girl. The same child I once carried on my shoulders. The same girl whose tiny fingers used to curl around mine when she was afraid of crossing the road. That day, her hands didn't tremble. She was calm, polished, prepared. And beside her, with his smug little smirk, sat her husband, the man I had tolerated but never trusted. He looked at me like he had already won, as though the king was already dethroned and he was simply waiting to put on the crown. The meeting started in a blur. Papers slid across the table toward me. Legal jargon, financial terms, promises of streamlining and transition. I should have seen through it. I should have smelled the trap. But when betrayal wears the face of your own child, you don't question, it feels unthinkable. I told myself this was for the good of the company, that my daughter only wanted to shoulder some responsibility. But each signature I gave was another nail in my own coffin. I didn't realize until it was too late. The final page wasn't about partnership. It was about replacement. In the quiet strike of pens and the shuffle of paper, I watched my empire stolen right out of my hands. My daughter became the face of the company. Her husband, the puppeteer in the shadows, became the true power. And me. I was erased like chalk from a blackboard. When the meeting ended, no one clapped, no one congratulated me. They all knew what had just happened. My legacy, my kingdom, had been snatched away. I sat there frozen, staring at the table, while my daughter and her husband walked out first, heads held high. Their footsteps echoed in the hallway like a victory march, each step hammering into my skull. The humiliation didn't stop there. That afternoon, I returned to my office, the one I had spent decades in, the one where every inch of the furniture carried a memory. But the nameplate with my name was already gone. My desk was cleared, my personal things shoved into a box like I was some disposable employee. My daughter's husband was already seated in my chair, spinning it like a child who'd stolen a toy, and smiling at me as if daring me to say something. I didn't. I walked out of that building with a cardboard box in my arms, the same way I had once walked in 30 years earlier with only a folder and a dream. Except this time, I wasn't a young man chasing hope, I was an old fool chased out by betrayal. That night, as I sat alone in my home office, staring at the walls, I realized something. Betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes, it comes from the ones you raised, the ones you trusted the most. And when betrayal comes from family, it doesn't just sting, it breaks something deep inside you. But here's the thing about being broken. You either stay shattered, or you rebuild stronger, sharper, unrecognizable. That was the night the seed of revenge was planted in me. Quietly, silently, but firmly. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I let them believe they had destroyed me. But deep inside, I swore this wasn't the end of my story. No, this was just the beginning of a different one. A darker one. And though I didn't know it yet, the day my throne fell was the same day I began building the fire that would one day consume them both. Humiliation has a way of finding you when you least expect it. It creeps into moments that should have been ordinary, moments where I could have at least been left in peace. But no, my daughter and her husband made it their mission not just to take the company, but to crush my dignity under their heels in every possible way. The first time it happened was at a family dinner. Normally, these dinners were a time when everyone gathered, laughed, shared stories, and remembered who we were outside the boardrooms and offices. But this time, I walked in and immediately noticed the change. My usual seat at the head of the table, the one I had occupied for decades, was already taken. My daughter's husband sat there, his arms stretched across the armrests like a king enjoying his throne. And she sat beside him, beaming with that pride of ownership, as if the entire family was there to witness their coronation. No one told me where to sit. My chair was simply gone. I stood there for a moment, stunned, waiting for anyone, to correct it. But instead, one of the younger cousins slid a chair at the far end of the table and muttered something about making room. I sat there, my hands tightening around the utensils, while laughter and chatter filled the air, all of it orbiting around them. Throughout the dinner, they made little comments, always just sharp enough to cut. When business came up, my daughter corrected me on details, almost gleefully, pointing out how things had changed since your time. Her husband chuckled after every line, fueling the fire, looking around to make sure everyone was watching. Even the cousins, kids I had watched grow up, smirked, as if they too had forgotten who had built the foundation of everything around them. I laughed along, though my chest burned. I laughed because I knew showing pain would give them more satisfaction. And that's when I realized this wasn't about them running the company anymore. This was about them erasing me, piece by piece, in front of the people who mattered most. But humiliation didn't stop at family gatherings. It seeped into the professional world too. They made sure of that. At board meetings, they would interrupt me, mock my ideas, call them outdated. They used me as a living prop, the old relic to make themselves look more modern, more capable. They'd smile at the investors and joke about how times had changed, how we've moved past the old ways of doing things. Every word was a dagger. Worse still, employees I once considered loyal, men and women whose salaries I had personally signed, whose careers I had nurtured, started avoiding me. Some even laughed at the jokes. I saw them glance at each other when my daughter's husband spoke down to me, their smirks betraying that they had already picked their side. The office, once my kingdom, had become a circus. And I was the clown. Even outside those walls, the humiliation followed me. At social gatherings, friends whispered questions they didn't dare ask directly. Some looked at me with pity, others with thinly veiled amusement. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, the silent judgment that the mighty had fallen. People who once sought my advice now brushed me aside, eager to rub shoulders with a new power couple. The worst moment came at a charity gala. I had been invited long before the takeover, and I assumed, naively, that I'd still be treated with some respect. But as I stepped onto the stage to present a donation, my daughter's husband interrupted, pulling me aside mid-sentence and taking the microphone. He announced a new era of leadership in front of hundreds of guests, casually brushing me off as if I were a footnote in history. The audience clapped, not realizing they were applauding the death of my dignity. That night, as I sat alone, I felt the humiliation curl around me like smoke. Every insult, every smirk, every stolen moment of respect replayed in my head until it was unbearable. I had gone from king to jester, from respected patriarch to pitiful shadow. And yet, in the middle of that suffocating shame, something strange happened. I didn't feel weak. I felt sharper. Every word they had used to humiliate me turned into fuel. Every laugh at my expense became a log on the fire burning in my chest. They thought they were breaking me, but all they were doing was hardening me. I wasn't a shattered man. I was a sword being forged in fire. Humiliation wears many faces. That month, I saw all of them: mockery, pity, rejection, erasure. But I also saw something else: their arrogance. They believed they had won so completely that they no longer guarded themselves. And arrogance, I knew, was the easiest crack to exploit. They thought I was nothing. But in truth, I was silent because I was planning. They thought they were burying me, but all they had done was plant me deeper. And one day, when the time was right, I knew I would rise, not quietly, but with thunder. After weeks of being humiliated, I learned a lesson most people never grasp. Sometimes silence is louder than words. At first, I wanted to scream, to stand in the middle of those dinners and meetings and shout the truth. I wanted to tell everyone how they had stolen everything from me. But then I realized, anger makes you predictable. Silence makes you dangerous. So I built myself a mask. On the outside, I wore a calm, almost cheerful expression. I laughed at their jokes, nodded when they mocked me, and pretended as if their insults rolled right off my shoulders. But inside, every word was another scar I carved into my memory. Every smirk was ammunition I stored for later. People began to believe I had accepted defeat. My daughter and her husband, especially, mistook my quietness for weakness. They thought I was shrinking away, a broken man retreating into the shadows. That was their mistake. They never realized silence is a hunter's cloak, and I had already started stalking. I stopped arguing in board meetings. When my daughter's husband belittled me in front of the team, I smiled faintly and jotted down notes. He thought I was documenting his brilliance. In reality, I was writing down his mistakes. When my daughter corrected me at family dinners, I didn't fight back. I complimented her confidence. But in my mind, I was cataloguing every arrogance, every flaw, every blind spot. The silence began to confuse them. They expected me to fight, to beg, to lash out. But when I didn't, they grew bolder, cockier. They started speaking freely, revealing things they shouldn't in front of me, assuming the old man had no bite left. They whispered about risky deals, about investors they were stringing along, about money flowing through cracks I could already see widening. And they never realized I was listening to every word. In public, my silence became a mask of humility. People whispered that maybe I had accepted the change gracefully, that perhaps I was letting the younger generation take over. Some even praised me for it, patting me on the back for being wise enough to step aside. If only they knew. If only they could hear the roar inside my chest, the storm waiting behind the calm. But silence doesn't just fool enemies, it buys you time. And time, I knew, was what I needed most. Every day I stayed quiet was another day closer to my revenge. I used that time to rebuild quietly. I called old friends, people I hadn't spoken to in years but who still respected me. I reconnected with former employees who had left the company disillusioned. Over coffee meetings and quiet dinners, I rebuilt my network, brick by brick, without drawing any attention. My daughter and her husband had the crown, but I had something they didn't: history. People remembered the man I used to be. They remembered my leadership, my vision, my sacrifices. And though they couldn't say it aloud, many of them missed it. My silence allowed that nostalgia to grow. The louder my daughter's husband boasted, the more people longed for the steady voice I once provided. At night, I would sit in my study, the room lit only by the glow of my desk lamp. I didn't drink anymore, didn't drown myself in self-pity. Instead, I wrote plans, ideas, weaknesses I had spotted in them, strengths I still had left in me. Every page was another step toward the revenge I knew was coming. I remember one night, staring at a photo on my desk of my daughter as a child, smiling with missing teeth, clutching a teddy bear. For a moment, I almost faltered. I almost convinced myself to forgive her, to let it go, to accept that maybe this was just life. But then I remembered her laughter at the dinner table when her husband mocked me. I remembered the way she didn't even flinch when I was stripped of my office, the way she stood there with pride. That memory hardened me again. Silence became my shield, and I wore it so well that eventually even I began to believe it. I became invisible in their world, a ghost drifting through rooms, ignored and underestimated. But ghosts, as everyone knows, have a way of haunting. And I promised myself this: when I finally removed that mask of silence, the sound would be deafening. Revenge doesn't grow overnight. It's not like a spark that bursts into fire the moment you strike a match. No, revenge is like a seed. You plant it in silence, you water it with patience, and you wait for it to grow in the shadows until its roots are deep enough to break through stone. That was exactly what I started doing after I realized my mask of silence was working. The first seed I planted was in the world of loyalty. My daughter and her husband might have stolen the company, but they hadn't stolen everyone's respect. There were people out there who still remembered the man I used to be, the one who had given them chances when no one else would. So I started reaching out, quietly, carefully, like a fisherman casting lines into dark waters. Old employees who had been fired unfairly by my son-in-law. Business partners who had been slighted by their arrogance. Investors who had grown tired of empty promises. I sought them out, one by one, not as the fallen king begging for sympathy, but as a quiet voice of reason. Over coffee, over dinners in quiet corners of the city, I reminded them of how things once were. I didn't need to badmouth my daughter and her husband. Their arrogance had already done the work for me. All I had to do was listen. And the more I listened, the more allies I gained. The second seed was money. They thought they had taken everything from me, but they had forgotten one thing: I still had my mind. My experience was sharper than any contract, and I knew how to create opportunities from nothing. I began investing in small ventures, projects that looked insignificant on the surface but had strong potential. I used other names, other faces, to keep my hand hidden. Little by little, the money started to flow back. It wasn't about becoming rich again just yet. It was about creating fuel for the fire I was preparing to unleash. The third seed was knowledge. Information is more powerful than money, and I knew they were careless. My daughter's husband liked to talk, especially when he drank. He bragged about risky partnerships, shady deals, and shortcuts he took in business. At events, I sat quietly at the edges, listening, smiling, letting him underestimate me. Meanwhile, I collected every word like a jeweler collects diamonds. I built files, notes, timelines. I knew which contracts were failing, which clients were unhappy, and which investors were growing impatient. I didn't need to lift a single stone yet. All I had to do was watch them build their house on sand. But perhaps the most important seed of all was patience. That one was the hardest to plant because patience doesn't come naturally when your pride has been crushed. Every time they mocked me in public, every time I sat at the end of the family dinner table like an outcast, I wanted to strike back. I wanted to stand and rip the mask off their faces. But I swallowed the urge. I reminded myself that rushing would only make me look like the bitter old fool they already painted me to be. I wasn't going to play into their hands. Instead, I played the long game. I let them think they had broken me completely. I let them believe I had accepted my new role as the invisible old man. The more they believed it, the less careful they became. They bragged more openly, they spent more recklessly, they mocked me more viciously. Every move they made was another thread unraveling from their golden robe. And I was the one collecting those threads, one by one, until I had enough to weave a noose. One night, as I sat in my study with the lamp casting shadows across my desk, I realized something. Revenge wasn't just about destroying them. It was about reminding the world who I was. They had tried to bury me under humiliation, but I was already growing in secret. I imagined it like a tree pushing through the soil, its roots strong, its branches stretching higher every day. The seeds had been planted. The soil was rich with their arrogance, their greed, their blind spots. All I had to do was wait for the right season to harvest. And when that season came, I promised myself I wouldn't just take back what they stole. I would make sure the entire world saw them fall. The thing about crowns is this: they look heavy, but the people wearing them often forget just how fragile they really are. My daughter and her husband strutted around with their shiny new crowns, convinced they were untouchable. They paraded their power at dinners, meetings, and galas, flaunting every ounce of control they thought they had. But arrogance blinds faster than alcohol, and soon I began to notice the cracks. At first, they were small, almost invisible. The kind of cracks most people would ignore. But I had spent decades building and running that company, and I knew exactly where to look. I saw the way they spent money like it was water. They threw lavish parties, sponsored unnecessary events, and bought luxury cars just to show off. The company wasn't a business to them. It had become their personal toy. They thought revenue was endless, profits automatic. But businesses don't run on arrogance. They run on discipline, and that was something they lacked. I noticed investors growing restless. Some of them reached out to me privately, hesitant at first, but eventually confessing their doubts. They complained of poor communication, risky strategies, and a lack of direction. My daughter's husband promised them big returns, but delivered only flashy presentations with no solid numbers behind them. Investors can be dazzled once or twice, but not forever. I knew it was only a matter of time before their patience ran out. Employees, too, started whispering. When I visited the building, no longer as the boss, but as a man who still had friends there, I heard things. Late payments. Layoffs. Sudden changes in leadership without explanation. My daughter tried to maintain her sweet smile, but beneath it, she was stretched thin. Her husband, on the other hand, barked orders with the desperation of a man trying to control a flood with his bare hands. One day, I overheard something that nearly made me laugh out loud. At a networking event, one of their managers let slip that a big project they had announced, one they had bragged about for months, was failing miserably. Costs had doubled, deadlines were missed, and clients were pulling out. But instead of admitting their failure, they kept the facade alive, pouring more money into a sinking ship. It was a mistake I had seen rivals make before, a mistake I had always avoided. And now, my own blood was walking straight into it. The cracks widened when the press caught a whiff of trouble. A small article appeared in a local paper, questioning the company's direction under new leadership. It wasn't much, but I knew how these things worked. One spark could start a firestorm. And once the media smelled smoke, they wouldn't stop until they found the flames. I didn't push. I didn't need to. I simply stood by, smiling politely whenever someone mentioned how different things seemed under my daughter and her husband. Inwardly, I savored every moment. Watching them stumble was like watching a child who had stolen your shoes trip while trying to run in them. They had taken something too big for them to carry, and now the weight was dragging them down. But the sweetest part? They still didn't see it. They were too blinded by their own arrogance to notice the walls closing in. They kept mocking me, kept parading me as the relic of the past. They had no idea that their empire was already crumbling beneath their feet, and I was the only one who had the patience to watch every stone fall. I remember one family dinner in particular. They were bragging about a major expansion, speaking loudly, as if to make sure the whole room heard. My daughter's husband even raised his glass to toast the future of our company. Everyone clapped. Everyone smiled. But I caught the flicker of panic in my daughter's eyes. She couldn't hide it from me. I had known her since the day she was born, and I knew when she was lying. That night, I realized the cracks weren't just in the company, they were in their marriage too. The weight of the crown was getting heavier, and soon it would crush them both. So, I waited. Patient, quiet, careful. The cracks in their crown were spreading, and when the time came, I would be the one to shatter it completely. Revenge is never loud at the start. It creeps in like a shadow, quiet and patient, waiting for the right moment to strike. By the time my daughter and her husband realized I was no longer the broken old man sitting in the corner, it was already too late. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. They had been boasting for months about a historic deal that would skyrocket the company into a new era. They threw money at marketing campaigns, plastered their faces on glossy magazines, and held press conferences where they stood side by side like royalty. Everyone was supposed to be impressed. Everyone was supposed to clap. But I knew better. I knew the numbers didn't add up. Their historic deal was nothing more than smoke and mirrors, a gamble with funds they didn't actually have. I had been quietly collecting information, talking to the right people, and keeping a close watch on the cracks in their empire. And finally, I saw my opening. It happened at a high-profile gala, the kind where every investor, journalist, and competitor shows up dressed in their finest. My daughter's husband stood on stage, microphone in hand, boasting about record profits and massive growth. His voice boomed, his smile gleamed under the chandeliers, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He was nervous, twitchy, desperate. He knew he was walking on thin ice. As the applause filled the hall, I made my move. No, I didn't storm the stage. That would have been too crude. Revenge isn't about shouting, it's about precision. Instead, I slipped into conversations with the right people, investors, journalists, rival CEOs. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't even raise my voice. I simply asked questions. Questions that planted seeds of doubt. Did you notice how quickly their expenses have grown? Strange, isn't it, that the numbers in their last report don't align with their projections? Have you heard about the suppliers who haven't been paid yet? I watched as whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. Smiles faded. Investors glanced at each other uneasily. Journalists scribbled in their notebooks, eyes gleaming at the scent of scandal. And on stage, my son-in-law kept talking, unaware that the very ground beneath him was shifting. The next morning, the headlines hit like thunder. Articles questioned the stability of their empire, rumors of unpaid debt surfaced, and whispers of mismanagement grew louder. Investors started pulling back, one after another. Clients cancelled deals. The stock value dipped, and with it, their carefully polished image cracked for all the world to see. But I wasn't finished. I had been building my own ventures quietly in the shadows, small companies, partnerships, projects that nobody connected to me. Now, I began unveiling them, one at a time. While their empire stumbled, mine rose quietly from the ashes. I didn't need to brag. I didn't need to boast. The results spoke for themselves. People who had once mocked me now came knocking at my door. Old allies, forgotten investors, even employees who had once betrayed me, suddenly, they remembered who I was. They wanted stability, they wanted leadership, and they knew where to find it. The strike was complete when one of their biggest investors, a man who had once publicly laughed at me, pulled out of their company and joined mine instead. That single move sent shockwaves through the business world. My daughter and her husband weren't just weakened, they were bleeding. I'll never forget the look on their faces when we crossed paths at a private meeting soon after. My daughter's husband, once smug and untouchable, looked pale and exhausted, his shoulders slumped as though the crown he wore had turned to iron. My daughter, her smile brittle, avoided my eyes. They both knew. They both understood. The man they had mocked, the man they had humiliated, the man they thought they had buried, had returned stronger than ever. And the best part? I hadn't raised my voice once. The strike of shadows was complete. I didn't need to scream or fight or make a scene. I let their arrogance destroy them, and I simply turned on the light so everyone could see it. But in my heart, I knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning of their real downfall. Because revenge doesn't end with whispers and headlines. Revenge ends when the people who tried to bury you are forced to kneel at the ruins of their own empire, and see you standing tall above them. There are many kinds of betrayal in this world, but nothing cuts deeper than the betrayal of your own child. Losing my company to my daughter and her husband was one wound, but seeing her join in the humiliation, watching her laugh at my expense, watching her turn her back on the very man who raised her, that was a wound that never stopped bleeding. I told myself for weeks that maybe she was just influenced by her husband. That maybe the girl I raised, the girl who once ran to me with scraped knees, the girl whose tears I used to wipe away, was still somewhere inside her. But every time I saw her, that illusion crumbled. She wasn't a little girl anymore. She wasn't even my daughter anymore. She was someone else, someone who had chosen power over blood, greed over love. I'll never forget the night I finally saw her for who she had become. She called me to meet her for dinner, just the two of us. For a brief moment, I let myself believe she wanted to talk, to apologize, to explain why she had stood by while her husband paraded me like a fool. Maybe she wanted to bridge the gap, maybe she wanted to make amends. That small, foolish hope tugged at my chest as I walked into the restaurant. She was already there, sitting in the corner, dressed like a queen. Expensive jewelry sparkled on her wrists, her posture stiff and confident. When she saw me, she smiled, not the warm smile I remembered, but a practiced one, the kind you put on for cameras and strangers. We ate, we talked, and for a moment I almost forgot the war between us. But then, she leaned in, her voice calm, and told me I should accept that things had changed. That it was her time now. That I had done my part, and the company was better in her hands. Better in her hands. The words echoed in my head like a hammer hitting steel. I stared at her across the table, and for the first time, I didn't see my daughter. I saw an enemy. An enemy who wore my blood but no longer carried my love. When I didn't respond, she filled the silence with laughter, telling me about their new expansion, their vision, their success. Every sentence was another blade, and I sat there, silent, bleeding on the inside but showing nothing on my face. After dinner, as we parted ways, she hugged me. And that hug felt colder than any stranger's touch. It was then I knew there was no saving her. She wasn't lost, she had chosen her path. And it wasn't with me. That night, back in my study, I stared at her childhood photos. The little girl with missing teeth, the teenager in her graduation gown, the young woman smiling as I handed her the keys to her first car. Memories that once filled me with pride now felt like ashes in my mouth. She had been my pride, my hope, my future. And now, she was my betrayer. But betrayal is funny. At first, it breaks you. It makes you question everything, your worth, your choices, even your ability to love. But then, if you're strong enough, it hardens you. It turns pain into purpose. Her betrayal lit a fire in me that no humiliation could have sparked. Losing a company hurt, yes. Being mocked hurt, yes. But realizing that my own daughter had chosen to stand with my enemies instead of me, that turned my revenge from a plan into a mission. I knew she would eventually try to come back to me, not out of love, but out of necessity. When their empire cracked, when her husband stumbled, when the crown grew too heavy for her head, she would come knocking, hoping her father would save her again. And I knew, when that moment came, I wouldn't open the door. I loved her once more than anything in this world. But love cannot survive betrayal. Love cannot survive watching your own blood choose greed and humiliation over loyalty and respect. From that night onward, I no longer saw her as my daughter. She had chosen to be my opponent, and so my revenge would have no mercy. I whispered to myself as I closed her photo album, "You took everything from me. Now, I will take everything from you." And I meant every word. If my daughter's betrayal was like a knife through the heart, then her husband's collapse was like a show I had been waiting to watch for years. From the very beginning, I had never trusted him. He was the kind of man who walked into a room with cologne strong enough to choke a horse, a grin so wide it looked painted on, and the kind of handshake that tried too hard to prove something. He had always been arrogant, but now, sitting on the throne he had stolen, he was worse than ever. He believed himself untouchable. At board meetings, he talked over seasoned professionals who had been running divisions long before he even knew how to tie a tie. He waved away concerns, mocked suggestions, and made promises so grand they could only be born out of delusion. He wasn't running the company, he was gambling with it, betting on his own ego as if it were indestructible. The thing about arrogance is, it blinds you to reality. He thought his charisma could replace competence, his loud voice could replace experience, and his reckless spending could replace strategy. But business doesn't care about arrogance. Numbers don't bend to smiles. Contracts don't honor ego. Slowly, painfully, reality began to bite back. The first blow came in the form of a failed partnership. He had boasted for months about a foreign investor, claiming it would be the biggest deal of the year. He bragged at every event, puffed his chest at every press conference, but behind the scenes, the investor was growing impatient. Promises weren't being delivered, deadlines weren't met, and funds were being misused. By the time the deal collapsed, the damage was public. Headlines splashed across the news, calling it a misstep in leadership. Investors didn't call it a misstep. They called it incompetence. The second blow was internal. Employees who had once tolerated him grew restless. He barked orders like a dictator, expected loyalty without respect, and treated every failure as someone else's fault. People began leaving, quietly at first, then in waves. Some of the company's brightest minds slipped through his fingers, and he didn't even notice until it was too late. Then came the money. His lifestyle was bleeding the company dry. Luxury cars, extravagant trips, private events, all billed under the company's expenses. Shareholders started asking questions. At first, he brushed them off with charm and bravado. But charm is like sugar. It dissolves quickly when you pour too much of it in. The shareholders grew tired, and suspicion turned into anger. I didn't need to push him. I didn't need to sabotage him. He was doing it all himself. Every arrogant decision, every careless gamble, every smug dismissal, it was all digging his own grave. All I did was watch, smile politely, and make sure the right people noticed at the right time. And oh, did they notice? One evening, I attended a meeting where he was supposed to pitch a new expansion plan. He strutted into the room in an overpriced suit, wearing that same grin, but this time, something was different. The room wasn't filled with admiration, it was filled with doubt. People shifted in their seats, avoided his eyes, whispered to each other while he spoke. His slides glitched, his numbers didn't add up, and for the first time, he stuttered. The man who once mocked me for being old-fashioned now stood sweating under the same spotlight he had craved. When the meeting ended, silence filled the room. No applause. No congratulations. Just silence. And in that silence, I caught his eye. For the first time, there was no arrogance, no smugness. Just fear. From that day, his downfall accelerated. Investors pulled out. Clients stopped answering calls. Journalists dug deeper, unearthing stories of mismanagement and waste. He was no longer a king, he was a clown, and the world was laughing. My daughter tried to hold him up, tried to plaster a smile over the ruins, but even she couldn't hide the truth. Her husband, the man she had chosen over her own father, was collapsing. And I savored every moment. The collapse wasn't quick. It was slow, humiliating, agonizing. The kind of collapse where every day you lose a little more, until finally, you look in the mirror and don't recognize the man staring back. He had once strutted around like he owned the world, and now he could barely walk into a room without whispers chasing him. Watching him fall wasn't just satisfying, it was justice. For every insult he had thrown my way, for every smirk, for every humiliation, this was the answer. He had destroyed himself, and I had front row seats to the show. And as I watched him stumble further into ruin, I thought to myself, sometimes revenge doesn't require a sword. Sometimes, you just hand your enemy a shovel, and they do the digging for you. The fall of my daughter and her husband wasn't a thunderclap, it was a slow crumble, a castle collapsing brick by brick, until nothing remained but dust and shame. And in that dust, I began to rise. For months, I had been preparing in silence. While they were busy flaunting their crowns, I had been quietly gathering allies, building ventures under different names, and weaving a safety net so wide they wouldn't even see it until they were already tangled in it. When their empire began to falter, I didn't need to strike hard, I simply revealed what I had already built. It started with the investors. Those same men and women who once laughed at me, who once clapped for my daughter's husband as he boasted about numbers he could never deliver. Now, they came back to me. They came cautiously at first, testing the waters, asking if I was still interested in advising. I didn't rush to answer. I let them squirm, let them feel the weight of their earlier betrayal. Then, slowly, I opened my hands. I showed them the ventures I had been nurturing in secret, the clean balance sheets, the promising projects, the steady leadership. It was like watching starving wolves see food for the first time. They jumped. Once the investors shifted, the employees followed. People I hadn't spoken to in years started knocking on my door. They told me about the chaos in the company, the constant yelling, the broken systems, the missed payments. They missed stability, they missed clarity, they missed me. And I welcomed them, not because I had forgotten how they once turned their backs, but because every returning soldier makes your army stronger. I'll never forget the day I walked back into that boardroom, not as a guest, not as a relic, but as the man reclaiming his throne. The room was silent when I entered. My daughter and her husband sat there, their faces pale, their smiles brittle. Papers lay scattered on the table, failed contracts, reports of losses, letters from angry clients. They looked nothing like the arrogant rulers they once were. They looked like children who had been caught playing a game far bigger than themselves. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The silence was enough. I sat down at the head of the table, my seat, the seat that had been mine long before they thought of stealing it, and for the first time in years, no one dared to question it. My name was on the contracts again. My vision was being spoken of with respect again. And the empire they thought they had destroyed was breathing under my command once more. The press noticed too. Articles that once questioned me now called it a remarkable comeback. They called me the phoenix who rose from the ashes, the man who outlasted betrayal, the leader who returned. My daughter and her husband, on the other hand, became the butt of every headline. Their arrogance, their waste, their mismanagement, it was all exposed for the world to see. They weren't remembered as rulers, they were remembered as cautionary tales. But the sweetest part wasn't the headlines. It was the look in their eyes. My daughter, once so proud, once so sure she was better than me, now sat quietly, her shoulders slumped, her face drained of confidence. Her husband, the man who used to smirk at me with that insufferable grin, couldn't even look me in the eye. He stared at the table, beaten, broken, humiliated in the same way he had once tried to humiliate me. In that moment, I realized something. Revenge isn't just about taking back what was stolen. It's about standing tall in front of the very people who tried to bury you and showing them you cannot be destroyed. It's about making them see that no matter how high they climbed, they were always standing on a mountain you built, and without you, it was destined to collapse. When I left that boardroom, my steps were steady, my head high. People greeted me with nods, with respect, with relief. It felt like breathing again after being underwater for too long. The throne was mine, not because I begged for it, but because they proved they were never worthy of it. And as I sat in my office that evening, the same office they once stole from me, now restored to its rightful owner, I allowed myself a smile. The war wasn't just won. It was over. But I also knew this: revenge doesn't erase betrayal. It doesn't heal the wounds. My company was back, my throne was reclaimed, but the scars left by my own daughter's choices would never fade. Still, if she and her husband had thought they had ended me, they now knew the truth. The king had returned. Revenge isn't a moment. It's not just a strike, not just a single scene where everything flips. Revenge is a slow satisfaction, a taste that lingers long after the battle has been won. And as I sat in my office, the one they once ripped away from me, I finally understood what the sweetest revenge truly felt like. It wasn't the money. Though the company was mine again, the numbers on the balance sheets weren't what made my heart steady with triumph. It wasn't the headlines either, even though they praised my return, calling me the man who rose from ashes, the leader who could not be broken. Those were gratifying, yes, but they weren't the core of it. The real sweetness came from watching them live in the ruins they had built for themselves. My daughter and her husband had walked so proudly into my empire, convinced they could rule better than me. They thought arrogance was strength, thought greed was vision. They believed they had written me out of the story, but now they were nothing more than footnotes. When they entered a room, people whispered, not about their power, but about their failure. Investors avoided them, journalists mocked them, former employees sneered at their names. The power couple who once strutted across stages were now ghosts, hollow and unwanted. My daughter. She tried to mask it. She put on her practiced smile, but I could see through it. Every time she passed the building, her eyes flickered with something between shame and longing. She had grown up inside these walls, watching me build this empire brick by brick. And now, she had to live with the knowledge that she had betrayed her own father only to end up empty-handed. She lost the company. She lost the respect of the family. And she lost me. Her husband didn't even have that. He was worse off, mocked in business circles, avoided at events, his name forever tied to incompetence. The man who once laughed at me now avoided crowds, his arrogance shattered, his shoulders hunched. His phone calls went unanswered, his meetings cancelled, his so-called friends vanished. He had built his entire identity on being powerful, and now he had nothing. That was the sweetest revenge. Not their destruction, but their survival. Survival in a world where everyone remembered their failure. Survival in a world where my shadow loomed over them every single day. People often say revenge doesn't heal the wounds. Maybe they're right. I can't say the scars of betrayal disappeared. I still wake some nights thinking of the little girl who used to hold my hand, the one who once called me her hero. That girl is gone, and nothing will bring her back. But the pain of that loss became something else. It became the steel in my spine, the fire in my chest, the reason I fought instead of faded. I learned something important through it all. Betrayal can break you, but it can also build you. When they thought they had buried me, they didn't realize I was a seed. And seeds, when buried, don't die, they grow. They buried me in humiliation, in mockery, in rejection, but all it did was make my roots deeper and my branches stronger. And now, here I was, standing taller than ever, my empire flourishing again, my name restored. The sweetest revenge wasn't screaming at them, wasn't punishing them directly. It was thriving while they crumbled. It was proving that no matter how hard they tried to erase me, I was unerasable. Sometimes, I sit at my desk in the evening, the city lights flickering outside, and I think about it all. The fall, the humiliation, the silence, the planning, the rise. It feels like a story, a long, painful story with a bittersweet ending. But the ending is mine. Not theirs. Mine. And every time I hear whispers about them struggling, every time I see them shrink at events, every time I catch the look in my daughter's eyes when she remembers what she lost, that is the taste of the sweetest revenge. Because they didn't just fail. They failed while I succeeded. They didn't just lose. They lost everything while I regained everything. And nothing, absolutely nothing, could be sweeter than that. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel. That's free and only way to support us. Thank you.